There's a moment at every family dinner where you realize the room isn't built for you. Not because anyone says so. Nobody has to. It's in the way conversations curve around you like water moving past a stone. You're there, you're solid, but somehow nothing lands on you. You just redirect the flow. I had lived inside that feeling for most of my adult life. By 33, I had gotten good at it. Good at not expecting much. Good at sitting at the end of the table with a glass of something I wasn't tasting and a calm expression that didn't cost me anything anymore. What I wasn't prepared for was my father's toast. He stood up, glass raised, voice steady the way it always was when an audience was watching. He said he was proud of his children. He looked at my older brother Daniel first, long pause, real warmth. Then at my younger sister Claire, soft eyes, the kind of smile you only give to people you actually like. Then his gaze moved toward me, and he just drank. No name, no pause, just a slight turn of the head, a sip, and then he moved on to saying something about the new property deal in Charlotte. I didn't react. I've had time to rehearse that part. What I didn't tell anyone that night, what I hadn't told anyone for 3 months, was that there was an envelope in the inside pocket of my jacket. I'd been carrying it like a splinter I wasn't ready to pull out. A thick envelope from a private lab in Manhattan. I knew roughly what it said, but knowing and reading are two different things. I'll get to the envelope. But first, I need to tell you how I got to that dinner table in the first place. My name is Daniel Carr. That's what it says on my driver's license, my Morgan Lincoln advisory credentials, my Columbia diploma. Daniel Carr, a name I borrowed from a man who never once claimed me in return. I grew up outside of Richmond, Virginia, in a house that looked warm from the street. Big oak in the front yard, wide porch, the kind of place people drove past and thought, somebody's doing well. And my father, Raymond Carr, was doing well. He built a mid-sized commercial real estate company from nothing, started with 2 strip malls in the late 80s, and by the time I was in high school, the Carr Group had offices in 3 states. Raymond was the kind of man who never needed to raise his voice. He had a way of making silence do the heavy lifting. You'd walk into a room where he was already seated and you'd feel it. This low-pressure system, like the air before a storm. Not dangerous, just heavy. My brother Marcus was 12 years older than me. He ran the Richmond branch of the company by the time he was 30. My father called him the one who gets it. Not in a mean way, not even in front of me, usually, just in the general direction of anyone who asked about succession. My sister Claire was 4 years younger than me. She had a way of moving through our family like she understood the rules without ever being taught them. She was easy. She was liked. Even Dad softened around her. And then there was me, the middle one, the one who chose piano over anything with a ball, the one who read economics textbooks at 14 and didn't understand why that wasn't impressive, the one who moved to New York at 22 and never really moved back. Not because I was running from anything, or at least, that's what I told myself. Just because the city made sense in a way Richmond never quite did. I used to think my father's distance was about preference. Some fathers like the son who plays ball. Some fathers want the one who looks like them, talks like them, fits naturally into the mold they built. Raymond wanted Marcus. I accepted that somewhere around age 16 and decided to build my own mold instead. 7 years at a top firm in New York, 2 certifications, a Wall Street Journal feature when I was 29, and the corner office with the view I still sometimes stopped to look at when the day got too quiet. None of it ever made him look up. The birthday gathering was held at the family estate, same as always. Raymond turned 65 this year. Not a small number in his world, not a private occasion. It was catered. There was a live string quartet for the first hour. The kind of party where people wore things they'd had pressed. I drove up from New York the afternoon before. I almost didn't go. I'd been sitting with that envelope for 11 weeks by then, and I knew being in that house would make it harder to stay calm. But there was something pulling me back, something I still needed to understand, or maybe confirm. So I packed a bag, booked a hotel room 2 miles from the estate, and told myself I'd stay 2 days maximum. The house smelled the same. Old wood, something floral from wherever my mother had placed fresh-cut things, and underneath it all that particular stillness that only comes from a home where not everyone is comfortable. My mother, Ellen, met me at the door. She was wearing the pale gray dress she always wore to formal things. She squeezed my arm instead of hugging me, which was her way, gentle, brief, safe. "You look tired," she said. "Long drive," I said. She nodded and didn't push. Ellen was never a pusher. She was the kind of woman who left things on counters hoping you'd pick them up on your own. Notes, apologies, warm food. Presents without pressure. It was kind mostly, but it had its limits. Marcus was already inside, doing what Marcus always did at these things, working the room like a campaign stop. Firm handshakes, easy eye contact, the practiced laugh. He was good at it. I didn't resent him for it. He'd earned that ease. He just also happened to have been given a head start the rest of us hadn't been offered. Claire found me in the kitchen about 20 minutes in. She was cutting lemons, which was her version of having something to do with her hands. "You good?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. She gave me the look she always gives me when she knows I'm lying, but doesn't want to make it a thing. Claire had 3 expressions for me: worried, careful, and sorry. She rotated through them, depending on the situation. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. Through the window, I could see my father walking the grounds with a couple of his old business contacts. His posture was relaxed, shoulders back, glass of something amber in hand. He looked like a man with no unfinished business. The envelope in my pocket felt like it weighed 12 pounds. I hadn't opened it. Not yet. But I could feel the edge of it every time I moved, a small reminder pressing against my ribs like a question that had already been answered, just not out loud. That night, at the dinner table, was when he gave the toast. And when his gaze passed over me like I was something decorative and unimportant, something shifted. Not the way things shift when you're surprised. The way they shift when you've already known the truth for a long time and your body finally catches up to what your mind has been quietly carrying. I set down my glass. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, straight-backed and still, while the conversation moved around me like I was furniture. And I thought, there's a reason it's always been this way. And I think I'm finally about to find out what it is. The morning after the dinner, I woke up early in the hotel room. The curtains were thin and the light came through in long pale strips across the carpet. I lay there for a few minutes not moving, just listening to the hum of the HVAC unit and the distant sound of a truck on the road outside. There's a particular kind of quiet that follows a night where something inside you has shifted. Not peace exactly, more like the silence after a door closes. You're not sure yet what's on the other side. You're just aware the door is shut. I got up, made the weak hotel coffee, and sat at the small desk by the window. The envelope was on the corner of the desk where I'd placed it the night before. Thick, cream-colored, with the lab's return address in the upper left corner. I looked at it for a moment, then looked away. I wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up an old photo folder. It was something I did sometimes when I needed to think, not out of nostalgia, just to anchor myself. To look at the record of things as they actually happened, not as I'd reconstructed them in memory. There was one photo I kept coming back to. A birthday party, my 7th. I'm standing at the end of a long picnic table in the backyard. Marcus is on my father's shoulders, laughing. Claire is in my mother's lap. And I'm standing slightly apart from the group, not unhappy, just positioned differently. Even then, like someone had placed the family in a photograph and then added me in a second pass. I remembered that day. I'd gotten a book on geography as a gift. It was what I asked for, and I carried it around all afternoon reading it while everyone else ran through the sprinklers. My father had said, only Daniel would ask for a book at his own birthday party. He'd said it to one of his friends, not to me, and the friend had laughed. It was one of those early moments you don't fully register as a wound until much later, when you're older and you start matching patterns. I first took the DNA test about 4 months earlier. It wasn't a dramatic decision. It started at work, actually. One of the analysts on my team had done one of those ancestry kits and came back with a result that completely rewrote his understanding of his family background. He talked about it at lunch one afternoon, and the table got into a longer conversation about genetics and family history. Someone mentioned that paternity verification was now standard in certain legal and estate planning contexts. I went home that night and didn't think about it consciously. But 2 weeks later, I was on the website, filling out the form. I told myself it was curiosity, just data. The kind of thing you do when you've been a numbers person your whole career and you want to close a loop that's been open for a long time. The result came back on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at my desk when the notification came through. I opened the report, read the main summary line, and then sat very still for about 4 minutes. No confirmed paternal biological match to the listed father. I didn't panic. I didn't feel the ceiling come down. It was more like standing in a room you've been in 100 times and suddenly noticing a door in the wall that was always there. You just never looked directly at it before. I closed the browser, went back to the spreadsheet I'd been working on, finished the afternoon like nothing had happened. Then I went to the gym, ran 4 miles, came home, and made dinner. I didn't talk to anyone about it. That was 11 weeks before the birthday party. In those 11 weeks, I went through several stages that I can only describe as very quiet. The first was a kind of retroactive inventory, going back through memories not to feel them again, but to re-examine them with this new variable in place. The way you'd audit a set of accounts when you suspect a discrepancy. Not emotional, methodical. I thought about the way Raymond looked at Marcus and the way he looked at me. I'd always assumed the difference was temperament, that Marcus simply matched him in ways I didn't. Interests, personality, ambition, style. That kind of thing happens in families. Not every father connects with every child the same way. But there were other things. Smaller things I'd filed away and never quite examined. The time I was 14 and overheard him on the phone saying that one takes after his mother's side in a tone that didn't mean anything generous. The fact that he came to 2 of Marcus's college games, but never to a single one of my academic competitions, even when they were held 40 minutes from the house. The way he'd look at me sometimes, not with dislike, exactly, but with something cooler, something managed, like a man exercising deliberate patience with a situation he hadn't chosen. I'd spent most of my life assuming that was just how he was, that I was the square peg and he was a round hole kind of man, that it was a mismatch, not a verdict. But a DNA test is a specific kind of fact, and once you have it, it reorganizes everything that came before it. The second stage was something more practical. I went back to the lab website and read their methodology. I checked the margins. I looked into the science of it because that's what I do. I verify before I act. The results were clear. The test I'd taken at home was directional, not legal grade, but it was accurate enough to tell me I needed to confirm. So about 6 weeks before the birthday party, I went home for what I told my mother was a quick visit. She was glad to see me. We had lunch. She showed me something she was growing in the back garden. And when she went to lie down in the afternoon, she had bad migraines. Always had. I slipped upstairs to the master bathroom. Raymond's comb was on the second shelf of the vanity. I took 3 strands, placed them in the small sealed bag I'd brought, put it in my jacket pocket, left within the hour. I sent it to a private clinical lab in Midtown Manhattan, paid for the priority processing, and then I waited. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, 9 days before the party. I signed for it at the front desk of my building, took the elevator up, set it on my desk, and didn't open it. Not that day, not the next, not for the 9 days between its arrival and the birthday gathering. Carrying it became a habit. I started bringing it with me in my jacket pocket the way you carry a phone, automatically, without thinking. Just there, just present. I knew, on some level, what it confirmed. The home test had already told me, but the lab envelope with Raymond's sample alongside mine, that was the final proof. And I wasn't sure I was ready for the finality of it. The morning after the dinner, I drove back to the estate to pick up some paperwork my mother had mentioned, old documents she wanted help sorting. Raymond was already out. A Saturday golf thing, apparently. The house was quieter. Claire was in the kitchen again. Different fruit this time. Peaches. We didn't say much for a few minutes. I poured water. She kept working. Then she said, without looking up, I saw his face when you stood up to leave last night. Did you notice he didn't even track the movement? I said I'd noticed. She set the knife down. He's never been fair to you. I know that. I've always known that. I didn't know what to do with it when we were kids. And then we got older, and it just became the shape of things. I told her I wasn't angry. She looked at me then. That's the part that worries me, Daniel. When you stop being angry about something that deserves it, that usually means something else is happening. She wasn't wrong, but I didn't explain. I picked up the papers, helped my mother organize 2 boxes of old household files, and then drove back to the hotel. On the way, I passed our old elementary school. The playground looked smaller than I remembered, the way things do when you finally stop measuring them against a child's perspective. That afternoon, I sat with the envelope again, turned it over in my hands, set it back down. Then my phone buzzed. An email notification, an unfamiliar address. The display name read, T. Ellis. The subject line was 4 words, I think you know. I stared at it for a long time without opening it. Then I put the phone face down, and I waited. I left the phone face down for about an hour. I'm not someone who avoids things. In my work, the whole job is about moving toward difficult information, not away from it. You look at the numbers that are telling you something is wrong, and you follow them. You don't set the report aside because the findings are uncomfortable. That's the whole point of the work. But this was different. This was a name I'd never heard spoken aloud in my presence, attached to a subject line that suggested someone out there knew more about my life than I had ever been told. And that combination, the unknown name, the quiet certainty in those 4 words, made me want to be very still before I did anything at all. So I sat by the window and watched the parking lot for a while. A woman was loading grocery bags into her trunk. A kid on a bike kept circling the same patch of asphalt. Normal Saturday afternoon movements. The kind of thing you watch when you need your mind to idle. After about an hour, I picked up the phone. I opened the email. It was short, 3 paragraphs. The writer introduced himself as Thomas Ellis. He said he had come across my name through a professional directory. I was listed as a speaker for a financial advisory conference the previous spring, and that he had spent several months deciding whether to reach out. He said he wasn't looking to cause any disruption. He said he understood if I didn't respond. Then he said this: "I knew your mother a long time ago. I believe you may have recently come across information that raised questions. If that's true, I just want you to know that you were not a mistake. You were a choice she made under a great deal of pressure, and I've respected that choice for 33 years. He included a phone number, a Columbus, Ohio area code, and then he signed off simply, Thomas. No dramatics, no demands, no language designed to pull a reaction from me. Just a quiet, careful note from a man who had clearly thought a long time about how to write it. I read it twice. Then I set the phone down again, this time on the desk, face up. I looked at the envelope beside it. 2 objects. Same answer. Different formats. I still didn't open the envelope that night. But something in me had reorganized. The question was no longer what is true. The question had shifted to what do I do with it. I want to go back a little, because there's context here that matters. When I was 26, I bought my father a car. Not a small gesture. A black full-size SUV. The exact make and model he'd pointed to once in a magazine when I was a teenager and said, now that's a real vehicle. I had it delivered to the Richmond house. I included a card. 1 line. Hope this is something you can use. I didn't hear anything for a week. Then my mother texted me. Dad put it in the garage. He said it's a nice one. That was it. No call. No acknowledgement of where it came from. I told myself that was fine. That was his style. He kept it. That was something. About 3 weeks later, I drove down unannounced for a weekend. I was walking around the side yard when I heard Raymond's voice from the back porch. He was with 2 of his old business associates, the ones he'd known since the early car group days. One of them pointed at the SUV in the driveway and said something about it being a nice upgrade. Raymond smiled, said a business contact had sent it over. Sweetening a deal. He said it easily, like it was true, like he'd said it before and expected to say it again. I stood behind the hedge for a moment. Then I walked back around the front of the house and sat on the porch steps until I felt like I could go inside without my expression saying anything. Later, Claire tried to explain it. She said he wasn't good at receiving things, that it was easier for him to reframe the gesture than to acknowledge it, that he probably did appreciate it, somewhere underneath all the calcified pride. I told her I understood. But I didn't really, because I'd watched him receive things from Marcus. I'd watched him receive a signed baseball from a client once and spend 20 minutes talking about it. I'd watched him take compliments, take praise, take gifts, all of it, easily, when it came from the right direction. The issue was never receiving. The issue was the source. That memory had been sitting in me for 7 years. I had never described it to anyone the way I just described it to you. I'd always found a softer framing for it, something that made it smaller than it was. A man with emotional limitations. A different generation, a communication gap. But sitting in that hotel room with Thomas Ellis's email on my phone and a sealed DNA lab report beside me, I was done finding softer framings. The next morning I drove to see a man named Gerald Oakes. Gerald had been the Carr family's attorney for over 20 years. He was in his late 60s, ran a small firm in downtown Richmond, and had the particular manner of someone who had witnessed a great many private things and had learned to carry them without expression. He was not warm, exactly, but he was steady, and I had always respected that. I hadn't called ahead. I drove to his office, parked, and asked the front desk if he had 20 minutes. They said he was between appointments. He came out to the waiting area, saw it was me, and nodded once. We sat in his office. Dark wood, closed blinds, the smell of old paper, and something faintly like cedar. I didn't give him a long explanation. I told him I had questions about the family estate documents, about the structure of the trust, about whether any provisions existed that were conditional on biological relationship. Gerald looked at me for a moment, the kind of look where someone is measuring not what you're asking, but what you already know. He said, "Estate documents in your family situation are written around legal relationships, not biological ones. Adoption, acknowledgement, name, these carry legal weight." I said I understood that. I asked whether he was aware of any documents in the estate that specifically addressed my position differently from Marcus's or Claire's. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Some things are written to preserve structure, not to be equitable." He didn't say more than that. He didn't need to. I thanked him and stood up to leave. As I reached the door, he said, without turning from his desk, "Daniel, whatever you're planning to do with what you know, make sure the timing is yours, not someone else's." I nodded and walked out. That afternoon, I sat in a coffee shop on Carey Street for about 2 hours. I had a notebook open, but I didn't write anything for the first 40 minutes. I just let things settle. There were a few things I now knew with reasonable certainty. 1. Raymond almost certainly knew I wasn't his biological son. The patterns were too consistent, the cold too calculated, to be the result of simple personality mismatch. This wasn't a man who struggled to express warmth. I had watched him be warm, many times, toward other people. Toward Marcus, toward Claire, even toward clients. The absence of it with me was not an accident of character. It was a position. 2. The estate structure was not going to include me on equal footing. Gerald hadn't said as much directly, but the phrase preserve structure had a meaning, and I understood it. 3. A man named Thomas Ellis had known about me for 33 years, had not intruded, and had now reached out with the kind of restraint that suggested he had thought carefully about what I might need rather than what he wanted. I wrote those 3 things down. Then I wrote one more line underneath them. What I do next is mine to decide. That mattered to me, not because I was building toward something dramatic, but because for most of my life, the important decisions about my place in my own family had been made by other people. Before I was born, before I was old enough to ask questions, before I had the information I needed to understand what was happening. This time, I had the information, and I was going to be methodical. I drove back to the hotel that evening as the light was going orange across the highway. Checked my messages. Nothing from my father. Nothing from Marcus. Claire had texted, "You doing okay?" I replied, "Yes. Talk soon." My mother had left a voicemail. Her voice was soft, a little careful. She said she hoped I was getting some rest, and that she'd made the chicken soup I used to like, and I was welcome to come by whenever. I listened to it twice. Then I sat at the desk, picked up the envelope, felt the weight of it. I held it for a while. Then slowly, I opened it. The language was clinical, formatted, precise, the way lab reports always are. But the conclusion was clear. No ambiguity. No margin of error wide enough to argue with. Raymond Carr was not my biological father. I folded the report carefully, put it back in the envelope, set it flat on the desk. Then I opened my laptop and typed a single reply to Thomas Ellis. "I received your message. I'm not ready to meet yet, but I want you to know I've read it, and I appreciate the way you wrote it." I hit send. Then I closed the laptop, turned off the light, and lay on the hotel bed in the dark for a long time. I wasn't devastated. I wasn't relieved. I was something quieter than either of those. The particular stillness of a person who has finally stopped waiting for a question to be answered and can now, for the first time, think about what comes next. The party was in 2 days, and I had some decisions to make. The day before the party, I woke up at 5:30 without an alarm. I lay there for a few minutes listening to the early morning quiet, the particular stillness of a city not yet fully running. Then I got up, made coffee, and sat at the desk with a legal pad and a pen. I'm not someone who processes things through emotion first. I process through structure. When something large happens in my professional life, a fund underperforms, a client relationship fractures, a deal falls apart, my first instinct is not to feel it, but to map it, to lay out what is true, what is uncertain, and what decisions are available. It's not that I don't feel things. It's that I find the map first, and the feeling follows at its own pace. So that morning I made a map. I wrote 3 columns across the top of the page. What I know, what I don't know, what I can control. Under the first column, Raymond is not my biological father. The estate is likely structured to reflect that. Thomas Ellis is my biological father and has known about me for 33 years. My mother made a choice under pressure to keep me. Raymond made a choice to stay and to say nothing, not to me, not ever. Under the second column, whether Raymond told anyone else in the family, whether the estate documents specifically exclude me or simply deprioritize me, whether my mother and Thomas Ellis had any contact after I was born, whether Claire or Marcus knew anything or suspected. Under the third column, the one that mattered most, I wrote 4 things. Whether I say anything at the party tomorrow, whether I speak to Raymond directly before it, whether I contact Thomas Ellis again and on what timeline, whether I take any formal steps regarding the estate. I looked at those 4 items for a long time. Then I drew a line through the first one. It wasn't a decision made in defeat. I want to be clear about that. There's a version of this story where I walk into that party, take a quiet moment at the right time, and say something that changes the room. That version exists. I considered it. I even felt the pull of it. The part of me that had sat at the end of that table for 33 years and been looked through, spoken past, systematically excluded from the recorded memory of a family that bore my borrowed name. That part of me wanted to be seen. Wanted it with a force I hadn't let myself fully acknowledge until I was sitting alone in a hotel room with confirmed documentation and nothing left to protect. But I thought about what Gerald Oakes had said. Make sure the timing is yours, not someone else's. A birthday party surrounded by business contacts and family friends and carefully curated appearances. That was Raymond's timing. That was his ground, his audience, his narrative, his control of the room. Anything I said there would be absorbed into his version of events before I finished the sentence. It would become, Daniel had some kind of episode, or he's always needed attention, or simply the raised eyebrow and the subject change, executed so smoothly no one in the room would even register what had happened. I had watched him do that my entire life. Absorb uncomfortable things and reframe them without blinking. It was one of his genuine talents. So I drew the line through that option. Not because I was afraid, because it wasn't the right tool for what I actually needed. What I needed wasn't a scene. What I needed was a record. I spent the morning at a FedEx office 3 blocks from the hotel. I made clean copies of 3 documents, the sealed lab report, the home DNA test result, and a 2-page personal summary I had typed up the night before. The summary was factual, time-stamped, written in plain language. It documented the sequence of events from the initial test through Thomas Ellis's email through the lab confirmation. No emotional language, no accusations, just a timeline with evidence attached. I made 2 copies and sealed each one in a separate envelope. Then I went to a notary on the same block and had the envelopes stamped and dated. One I kept, one I addressed to Gerald Oakes' office. Not to be opened, just to be held. A record that existed somewhere outside my own possession. If Raymond ever decided to rewrite the story later, there would be a time-stamped sealed document sitting in an attorney's office that told a different version. I dropped it in the mail on the way back to the hotel. This probably sounds overcalculated for something so personal. But here's the thing. I had spent my entire career learning that documentation is protection, not because you always use it, but because having it changes the terms of every conversation that follows. You move differently when you know the record exists. And the other person moves differently too, once they understand it. That afternoon, Claire called. She said she was coming to the hotel. I told her the room number. She arrived 20 minutes later wearing the kind of expression she'd been wearing since I got to Richmond, the careful one, the worried one. She sat in the chair by the window and looked at me for a moment before she said anything. Then she said, "I found something. A few years ago, when Mom asked me to help clean out the attic, there was a box of old papers, and inside it was a letter. I should have given it to you then. I didn't. I don't have a good reason. I was scared of what it would start." She reached into her bag and placed a small envelope on the desk between us. The paper was yellowed, soft at the corners. The handwriting on the front said simply, Angela, my mother's name, Ellen's middle name, what her family had always called her. I picked it up, opened it carefully. It was a letter dated 34 years ago. The handwriting was careful, slightly tilted, the kind of script that suggests someone writing slowly because they want the words to land right. The writer said he knew the situation was complicated. He said he understood she had made her decision and he was not going to pressure her to change it. He said one thing that I had to read twice. Whatever happens, I want the child to know, when the time is right, that he was not an accident. He was wanted, at least by me. And if there's ever a moment where knowing that matters, I hope you'll find a way to tell him. It was signed Thomas. I folded it back into the envelope, set it on the desk beside the lab report. Claire hadn't moved. Her hands were clasped in her lap, and she was watching me the way people watch someone who is carrying something heavy to see if they're going to drop it. I told her it was all right, that I wasn't angry at her. She said she was sorry anyway. I believed her. Claire has always had a conscience that worked properly. It had just been working under conditions that made honesty complicated, the same as everyone else in that house. That evening I drove to the estate. Not for dinner. Not for any planned interaction. I went because I needed to speak to Raymond before the party, and I needed to do it on my terms, quietly, privately, before any audience arrived. The caterers were setting up in the back. My mother was inside coordinating something with the florist. Marcus was on the phone in the study. I found Raymond by the old stone fountain in the side garden, glass of scotch in hand, looking at something in the middle distance the way he always did when he was either thinking or performing contentment. He heard me coming, didn't turn right away. When he did, his expression settled into the one I knew best. Neutral, managed, the face of a man who had decided in advance how this conversation would go. I kept my voice level. I said, I know you're not my biological father. I have documentation. I'm not here to cause a problem, but I want you to know that I know. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without any particular heat, I gave you my name. I put you through school. I gave you a foundation whether you used it the way I would have or not. I said, I know, and I'm not asking for an apology. He looked at me then, really looked at me, maybe for the first time in a long time. Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly, more like a long-held calculation finally meeting its conclusion. He said, then what are you asking for? I said, I'm asking you to understand that I know, and that I'm not going to pretend otherwise anymore. He took a slow sip of his drink, set the glass on the edge of the fountain. Then he said the thing that I think he'd been holding for 33 years, disguised always as something else. You were never the problem, Daniel. You were just the reminder. He didn't explain what he meant by that. He picked up his glass and walked back toward the house. I stood by the fountain for a while after he left. The garden was quiet. The caterers were moving around in the back. Somewhere inside, I could hear my mother's voice giving instructions. I thought about what he'd said. You were never the problem. You were just the reminder. I turned it over a few times. Then I understood it, not as an excuse, but as a fact. Every time he looked at me, he saw evidence of something that had happened in his marriage that he had never resolved, never addressed, never spoken aloud. He had managed it through silence and distance the way he managed everything that didn't fit his preferred structure. I was not his son, but I was also not his enemy. I was simply a fact he had decided to live around. That was a painful thing to finally understand clearly. But it was also, in a strange way, a relief. Because it meant the problem had never been me. Not my career choices, not my personality, not the piano or the economics textbooks or the city I chose to live in. It had been something that existed before I was old enough to understand it and had nothing to do with who I actually was. I walked back to my car. The party was tomorrow, and I had already said what needed to be said. The morning of the party, I took a long shower, made the hotel coffee, and sat by the window watching the street below come to life. It was a Saturday in early October. The light was that particular kind, thin, clean, the color of something just beginning to cool. Leaves on the trees along the sidewalk had started turning at the edges. Not fully, just enough that you could see the change coming. I had slept better than I expected. That surprised me a little. I had spent so many years carrying a low-grade version of this weight that now, with everything confirmed and spoken and documented, my body seemed to have finally gotten the message that it could stop bracing. The vigilance that had been running quietly underneath everything for as long as I could remember had dialed itself down overnight. Not gone, just quieter. I put on the suit I'd brought. Dark charcoal, well-fitted, the one I wore when I needed to feel like myself rather than like someone performing a version of themselves. I straightened the collar in the mirror, looked at my own face for a moment. Then I drove to the estate. The grounds were transformed. White tents along the back lawn. Rows of chairs dressed with cream ribbon. Servers moving in careful patterns with trays of things I couldn't identify from a distance. The string quartet was setting up near the terrace. Guests were beginning to arrive in slow clusters. Old business partners, family friends, local figures Raymond had accumulated over decades of careful relationship management. I parked along the side road and walked in through the garden entrance. A few people nodded at me. One woman I didn't recognize smiled politely and then looked past me for someone more familiar. I found my mother near the terrace. She was in a deep blue dress, hair pinned back, and she was doing the thing she always did at large gatherings, moving between people just slowly enough to seem present, just quickly enough to avoid extended conversation. She saw me and touched my arm briefly. "You look well," she said. "So do you," I said. She held my gaze for a moment longer than usual. There was something in her expression, not quite apology, not quite relief. Something in between, the face of a woman who had been waiting a long time for a particular kind of reckoning and wasn't sure yet whether what had arrived was going to be gentle or not. I told her quietly that I had spoken to Raymond the night before, that I wasn't going to make today difficult, that she didn't need to worry about the afternoon going sideways. She exhaled, small, controlled. She nodded once and then moved toward a group near the fountain. I got a glass of water from one of the passing trays and found a position near the back edge of the gathering, close enough to observe, far enough to stay out of the current. Marcus arrived about 20 minutes later. He moved through the crowd the way he always did, easy, unhurried, greeting people by name, asking about their businesses and their families with the practiced fluency of someone who understood that relationships were infrastructure. He was genuinely good at it. I had never resented that about him. It was a real skill, and he developed it honestly. He spotted me and crossed the lawn. We shook hands. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Not the clipped professionalism from our earlier conversation in his office. Something more careful than that. More personal. He said, "Dad told me you two spoke last night." I said I knew. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want you to know something." I didn't know. Not the specifics. I had a feeling, maybe, when I was older. The kind of feeling you get when things don't add up, but you don't go looking for the math. I didn't go looking. I told him I understood that. He said, "That's not an excuse." I said, "I know. I'm not treating it as one. But I'm also not holding it against you." He nodded, looked out across the lawn. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "You were always the sharpest one of us, you know." Dad knew it too. I think that was part of the problem. He said it plainly, without performance. Just a fact he'd apparently been holding for a while. I didn't respond to it immediately. I just let it sit between us for a moment because it deserved that. Then I said, "Take care of Mom. Whatever happens going forward with the estate and everything else, make sure she's okay." He looked at me. "You're not going to fight it?" I said, "There's nothing they're worth fighting for. What I wanted from this family wasn't in any document." He held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, and we left it there. The formal program began around 2 in the afternoon. Raymond took the stage, a low platform set up near the pergola, with the ease of a man completely at home in front of an audience. He was dressed impeccably, silver cufflinks, a tie the color of deep water. He had notes, but barely looked at them. He spoke about legacy, about what it meant to build something that outlasted you. He talked about the early years of the Carr Group, the risk of the first deal, the lessons of the second. He was compelling. He had always been compelling. Whatever else could be said about him, the man understood how to hold a room. Then he paused, smiled, and said, "A man is only as strong as the family standing behind him, and I am fortunate, genuinely fortunate, to have built something I can pass to people I trust." He looked at Marcus, extended his arm. Marcus walked up to the stage to applause, and Raymond placed a hand on his shoulder and said something quietly that made Marcus nod. Claire was called up a moment later. Warm words, real affection. She smiled the way she always did, genuinely, with a slight edge of discomfort she hid well. I stood at the back of the gathering with my water glass and watched. My name was not called, not even in passing, not in the list of family present, not in the acknowledgement of people who had traveled to be there. I was simply absent from the official record of the afternoon, the same way I had been absent from most of the official records of my life in this family. And I stood there, calm and still, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not hurt, not the old familiar sting of being skipped. Something different, something that took me a moment to identify. It was clarity, complete, quiet clarity. Because standing there watching Raymond perform the narrative he had built, the legacy, the name, the line of succession, I understood with absolute precision that there was nothing left here that I needed. Not his acknowledgement, not my name in a speech, not a share of an estate built around an identity that had never included me, not even the apology he would never give. I had spent 33 years oriented toward this man's approval without ever fully admitting that was what I was doing. Every degree, every promotion, every professional achievement had been aimed, at least partly, in his direction. Not consciously, but the vector was there if you looked at it honestly. And now I was looking at it honestly. And I was done. Toward the end of the formal program, Raymond stepped down from the platform and began moving through the crowd, the natural drift of a host working his gathering. He reached my corner of the lawn eventually. We stood about 4 feet apart. The nearest guests were far enough away that our conversation was private. He looked at me with the expression I now understood completely. Not hostility, not affection, the managed distance of a man who had made a decision 33 years ago and had been living inside the consequences of it ever since. I said, "I'm leaving after today. I won't be coming back for these things." He said, "That's your choice." I said, "I wanted you to know directly, not through a message or through the attorney or through anything else, just directly from me." He looked at me for a moment. Something moved through his expression, briefly, just at the edges. I couldn't name it precisely. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't quite regret. It was something older and more complicated than either of those. The look of a man standing at the end of a long series of choices he'd made, seeing the sum of them. Then he said, "You turned out fine, Daniel, in spite of everything." I held his gaze. I said, "I turned out fine because of my own work, not in spite of anything." He didn't respond to that. He gave a short nod. Then someone called his name from across the lawn, and he turned and moved toward them and was immediately absorbed back into his own event, back into the story he had spent decades constructing. I watched him go. Then I set my water glass on a nearby table, buttoned my jacket, and walked back through the garden entrance to my car. No one called after me. I didn't look back. I sat in the car for a few minutes before starting the engine. The sounds of the party drifted faintly through the closed windows, the murmur of conversation, someone laughing at something, the low thread of the string quartet starting a new piece. All of it familiar, all of it finished. I started the car, pulled out onto the road, drove back to the hotel in the afternoon light. I checked out of the hotel the next morning, packed everything into the bag, stripped the key card, left the room the way I'd found it. There's something about checking out of a hotel that has always felt clarifying to me. The deliberate erasure of your temporary presence, the stripping back to just what you came with. I find it satisfying in a way I've never fully articulated. I loaded the bag into the car and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before driving anywhere. I had 2 things I needed to do before I left Richmond. Neither of them was at the estate. The first was my mother. She'd called the night before, after the party had wound down. Her voice was quiet, a little worn. She didn't ask how I was feeling or what I was thinking. She just said, "Can we meet somewhere? Not the house. Somewhere that's just us." I said yes. We met at a bakery on the east side of town, a place she used to take me after school exams when I was young. Small, warm, the kind of place that smelled of butter and something faintly cinnamon. We sat at a corner table away from the window. She had a tea. I had coffee. We sat for a moment without speaking, the way you do when you've both arrived at the same place by different roads and need a moment to recognize each other across the distance. Then she told me. She didn't structure it as a confession. She didn't apologize, at least not in words. She just told me the way someone tells a thing they've been carrying alone for a very long time. Carefully, in the right order, making sure I understood each part before she moved to the next. She said she had met Thomas Ellis during a conference in Columbus. She was 28. She and Raymond had been married 3 years and things were already difficult in ways she hadn't known how to address. Thomas was an engineer. Thoughtful, she said. The kind of person who listened completely when you were talking. It lasted 6 months. Then it ended. Her decision, she said. Not because she didn't care for him, but because she had made a commitment and she was going to try to honor it. Then she found out she was pregnant. She said Raymond knew from the beginning. She had told him because she felt she owed him that honesty, and because she had believed, genuinely believed, that honesty was the foundation of whatever they were going to try to rebuild. Raymond had said he would stay. He would give the child his name. He would not speak of it, but he had never, in 33 years, been able to look at me without seeing the evidence of something he had agreed to absorb but never actually forgiven. She said, "I thought staying was the right thing. For you. I thought having a father, even a distant one, was better than the alternative. I'm not sure I was right about that." I looked at her across the small table. She was not crying, but her eyes were carrying something that looked like it had been waiting a long time to be set down. I said, "I don't think you made a wrong decision. I think you made the best decision you could see at the time." She said, "You're being kind." I said, "I'm being accurate." She looked at me the way mothers look at their children when the children have become someone larger than the mother's quite prepared for. Something between pride and a sadness that isn't quite sadness. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Not briefly. She held it there. It was the first time in my memory that she had done that, held on rather than just touched. And she didn't speak. She just kept her hand there while we sat in the warm bakery with our coffee and tea going slowly cold. I let her hold it. The second thing was Gerald Oakes. I stopped at his office on the way out of town. He wasn't expecting me, but his assistant showed me in after a few minutes. I sat across from his desk and told him directly that I would not be contesting the estate or pursuing any claim based on the documentation I had. I told him the envelope I had mailed to his office was for record purposes only and did not require any action on his part. He looked at me over his reading glasses. "You're certain?" I said I was. He wrote something on a notepad. Then he said, "For what it's worth, and I recognize it may not be worth much, Raymond did ask me once, a long time ago, whether there was a way to add a separate provision. Not equal, but something." I said, "What happened?" Gerald said, "He didn't follow through. He drafted the language twice. Never signed it." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "That sounds about right." I thanked him and left. I drove north out of Richmond in the mid-morning. The highway opened up quickly past the city limits, and I settled into the drive. For hours back to New York, give or take. I had a podcast queued up that I never played. I just drove in the quiet. Somewhere around the 2-hour mark, I pulled off at a rest area. Not because I needed anything, just to stop moving for a few minutes. There was a small grassy area beside the parking lot with a few trees just beginning to drop leaves. I stood under one of them and looked out at the highway. I thought about Thomas Ellis's letter, the one from 34 years ago that Claire had given me. He was wanted, at least by me. I thought about the drafts Raymond had never signed. I thought about my mother holding my hand across the table. I thought about Marcus saying you were always the sharpest one with no performance in it. Just the plain fact of a thing he'd noticed and never said. None of these things undid anything. I want to be clear about that. They didn't rewrite the record. The dinners I had sat through, the speeches I had been absent from, the graduated absences that had accumulated into a childhood and an adolescence and a relationship with a man who looked at me like I was something he had agreed to tolerate. None of that was softened or explained away by the partial, late-arriving acknowledgments of people who had their own reasons for staying quiet. But I didn't need them to undo it. I wasn't looking for revision. I was just looking, for the first time, at the whole picture with all the actual pieces in it. And what I saw was this. A woman who made a complicated choice under real pressure and tried to build something workable out of it, imperfectly, at significant personal cost. A man who agreed to something he never fully accepted, and who managed that failure of acceptance by shrinking me rather than examining himself. A biological father who had respected a boundary for 33 years and then, quietly, offered me a door. And me, 33 years old, sitting in a rest area off the I-95 corridor under a maple tree losing its leaves. Still standing, functional, in possession of the full truth for the first time in my life. I pulled out my phone. I opened Thomas Ellis's email. I typed, "I think I'm ready to meet. When you're in New York, let me know. No expectations. Just coffee." I hit send. Then I got back in the car and drove north. 3 weeks later, I was back in my apartment in New York. The city had settled into its fall rhythm. The sharp air, the quickened pace, the feeling of people who had returned from wherever they go in summer and gotten back to work. I liked New York in October. It suited me. A few things had shifted in the weeks since Richmond. I had drafted a brief letter to Gerald Oakes formally waiving any interest in the Carr estate. Not an emotional document. 1 page, factual, signed. I had it notarized and sent it. I received a brief acknowledgement in return. That was the end of that thread. I had also sent a longer letter to my mother. Not addressing everything. That would take more time, and some of it might not need to be addressed in writing at all. But telling her that I understood the position she had been in, that I didn't blame her for the choice she made, and that I wanted to stay in her life going forward on honest terms. She replied within a day. 2 paragraphs. Warm, careful, genuine. She said she would like that very much. Marcus had sent a text about 2 weeks after the party. It said, "I had a conversation with Dad. I won't tell you what was said, but I want you to know it happened. Take care of yourself." I replied, "You too." Claire had called twice. We had talked for a long time on the second call. The kind of conversation where you finally say the things that have been hovering just beneath the surface of every interaction for years. She cried at one point. I didn't, but I understood why she did. She had carried the letter for years, and that weight had its own shape. I told her to put it down. She said she was trying. Thomas Ellis came to New York on a Wednesday afternoon in late October. We met at a coffee shop in Midtown. Nothing remarkable about it. Small tables, big windows, the usual noise of a city afternoon filtering through the glass. He was in his early 60s, gray-haired, steady in his posture, the kind of man who occupied space without announcing himself. He stood when I came in, which I noted. He didn't reach for a handshake or a hug. He waited to see what I would do. I put out my hand. He shook it. We sat down. We ordered coffee. His, black. Mine with a little room. And then we just talked. Not about the past, not immediately. He asked about my work. I asked about his. He was semi-retired from a civil engineering firm, consulting part-time, living outside Columbus in a house with a garden he seemed genuinely invested in. He was calm in the way of someone who had lived long enough to stop performing calmness and simply had it. At some point he said, "I want you to know I'm not here to be your father. That's not something I can offer you at this stage, and it wouldn't be honest to try. I'm just a person who is glad you exist and wanted to say so in person." I said, "That's enough." He nodded. We stayed for about 2 hours. We didn't resolve anything, because there was nothing to resolve. We just sat together at a small table in the middle of an ordinary Wednesday and talked like two people who had arrived at the same place from very different directions and found, somewhat to their mutual surprise, that they didn't mind the company. When we left, he said he hoped we could do it again sometime. I said I thought we could. I walked back to my office in the October afternoon. The light was low and clean across the buildings. I passed a man reading on a bench outside a library, a woman walking a very small dog with great seriousness, 2 kids arguing about something outside a bodega. The city doing what it always does, just moving forward. I bought a coffee from a cart on 53rd and stood there for a moment drinking it, watching the street. Then I walked back to work. It's been about 2 months since Richmond. I'm back in my regular life now. The early mornings, the long hours at the desk, the particular rhythm of a city that doesn't pause for your interior weather. New York is good that way. It doesn't require you to perform recovery. It just keeps moving and lets you move with it when you're ready. My apartment is on the 14th floor of a building on the west side of Midtown. I've lived here for 6 years. It's not large, but it has good light in the mornings and a window in the kitchen that faces east, and most days I stand at that window with my first coffee and watch the light change for a few minutes before anything else starts. That's what I did this morning. Nothing dramatic about it. Just the window, the coffee, the slow arrival of daylight over the buildings. I've been thinking lately about what it means to put something down. Not to forget it. Not to declare it resolved in some clean, final way. Just to stop carrying it at the front of your body, where it catches on everything. To move it further back, where it becomes part of the weight you're accustomed to rather than the weight you're actively managing. I'm not sure I've fully done that yet, but I'm further along than I was in October. Further along than I was a year ago, when I didn't yet have the full picture and was still trying to make sense of a pattern I could feel but couldn't name. Having the picture helps. Even when the picture is hard, a few small things have settled. My mother and I speak on the phone every Sunday now. Not long calls, 20 minutes, maybe 30. She tells me about the garden, about things she's reading, about small domestic events that don't require much commentary. I tell her about work, about the city, about whatever I've been thinking about. We don't revisit Richmond directly, but there's something different in the texture of the calls now. Less careful, less managed. More like two people who have finally agreed to just talk. I think that will keep developing, slowly, at its own pace. That's fine. Thomas Ellis and I have exchanged a few emails. Nothing urgent or heavy. He recommended a book on structural engineering history that he thought I might find interesting, given my work with infrastructure investment portfolios. He was right. I sent him something in return, an article on urban economic modeling that I thought he might appreciate. He replied that he had read it twice. It's a quiet thing, whatever it is. I'm not trying to name it or shape it into something it isn't. It's two people finding out, carefully and without pressure, whether there's something worth building. That's enough for now. Marcus called last week. Not about the estate, not about family business. He called to ask whether I had any interest in having dinner when he was next in New York for a conference in December. I said yes. We haven't seen each other outside of Richmond in years. Maybe longer than I'd fully registered. I'm not reconstructing anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm not trying to retrofit warmth onto a family structure that was built without it. I'm just leaving doors open that I might have closed otherwise, and seeing what comes through them. Claire texts me most Thursdays. Usually something small, a photo she took somewhere, a question about a book, something funny she heard. It feels like the beginning of a friendship that should have existed earlier and is arriving now instead. I'll take it. Raymond and I have not spoken since the party. I don't expect that we will, at least not in any meaningful way. I have no anger toward him that requires resolution. I also have no path back to a relationship that never existed. What I have is a clear understanding of what happened and why, and that understanding has done something practical. It has stopped me from spending energy in his direction. For most of my adult life, some portion of my effort was aimed at him. Not consciously, not always visibly, but it was there. The undertow of someone always partially building toward an audience that was never going to respond the way you needed. That undertow is gone now. I notice its absence the way you notice a sound that's been present so long you stopped hearing it. Only by the quiet it leaves behind. My work feels different without it. Not easier, necessarily. The work is the same work, but the internal weight of it has shifted. When I close a good quarter or bring on a significant client or solve a problem I've been working on for weeks, the feeling that follows is clean. It lands and stays. It doesn't immediately start looking around for someone to report to. That's new. I'm still getting used to it. Some evenings I sit at the desk in my apartment after the workday has ended and I just read, or I write out whatever has been on my mind, or I sit with music playing low and do nothing in particular. Last week I pulled out the legal pad I'd used in the hotel room in Richmond. The 3 columns. What I know, what I don't know, what I can control. Most of the second column has moved to the first. The third column, what I can control, looks different now than it did then. It's smaller, in a way that feels like progress rather than loss. I've stopped trying to control things that were never mine to manage. The opinions of a man who had already decided his position. The shape of a family that was built around a silence I was never invited to understand. The inheritance of a name that was always borrowed. What I can control is narrower and more real than that list was 2 months ago. What I do with my work. How I spend my time. Who I let close. What I build going forward and why. That's a workable list. I can operate from that. I went for a walk yesterday evening along the river path on the west side. The air was cold and clean, that particular late autumn cold that has texture to it. You can feel it in your throat when you breathe deep. The water was slate gray and moving. A few other people were out, collars up, moving at their own paces. I walked for about an hour without any particular destination. At one point I stopped and stood at the railing and looked out at the water. A barge was moving south, slow and steady, carrying something I couldn't identify. I watched it until it passed out of view. Then I turned around and walked home. Made dinner. Simple, pasta, something green, olive oil. The kind of meal that doesn't require effort but still feels like you've taken care of yourself. I ate at the kitchen table instead of the desk, which is something I've been trying to do more often. Washed the dishes. Put things away. Wiped down the counter. Stood at the east window for a moment before bed, looking out at the quiet city. Then I went to sleep. There's someone I've been thinking about lately. A woman I know professionally. She works in compliance at a firm across town. We've been in the same industry circles for a few years. We're not close, but I've always found her careful, precise, the kind of person who measures twice before she speaks. A few weeks ago she mentioned, almost in passing, that she was dealing with a family situation involving a parent's estate and a sibling who had apparently been managing documents in ways she hadn't been told about. She said it without drama, the way you mention something that is sitting heavily enough to come out sideways in a work conversation. I didn't press. It wasn't my place. But I gave her my direct number and told her that if she ever wanted to talk through the practical side of navigating something like that, the documentation, the process, what questions to ask, I was available. She texted 2 days later to say she might take me up on that. I told her the offer stood. Some situations have a shape I recognize now. The slow realization that something in a family structure has been concealed or managed in ways you were excluded from. The particular disorientation of discovering that a story you thought you understood has been telling itself around you, not to you. The question of what to do with that understanding once you have it. I don't have a clean answer for her, or for anyone in that position. I only have what worked for me, which was to move carefully, document thoroughly, say what needed to be said quietly and directly, and then make decisions based on what I actually needed rather than what I thought I was supposed to want. That's not a formula. It's just what I learned. And if it's useful to her, or to anyone else sitting in a similar kind of quiet with a question they're not sure how to carry, then at least something came out of it that wasn't just mine. That's where things stand. No dramatic ending. No clean bow. Just a life that has been reoriented slightly by the kind of slow, methodical work that doesn't announce itself. I know who I am now in a way I didn't 2 months ago. Not because someone told me. Not because a piece of paper confirmed it. But because I stopped organizing myself around a question that was never going to be answered the way I needed and started organizing myself around the things I actually know to be true. I'm good at my work. I show up fully. I'm honest with the people I let close. I'm the son of a woman who made a hard choice under real pressure and loved me the best way she knew how. I'm the son of a man I've just begun to know, who waited 33 years with more patience than I probably would have managed. And I am my own person, built for my own work, carrying a name I'm still deciding what to do with. That's enough to start from. That's more than enough.